The morning sun filtered through the trees of Greenwood Park, its golden light creating a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere brewing near the old oak bench by the central fountain. Kim Kardashian, cloaked in an oversized hoodie and simple jeans, blended into the park's early hustle. Her hair was tucked under a baseball cap, and a reusable tote bag rested beside her, its contents hidden from view. To anyone passing by, she was just another figure in the park, anonymous and unassuming. But Kim Kardashian was far from just anyone. This was no casual morning stroll. Today was part of a larger mission, a social awareness campaign designed to shine a light on the biases and treatment faced by those society often overlooks. She had carefully orchestrated every detail, from her appearance to the live camera, discreetly embedded in her tote bag. Millions of her followers were already tuned in, waiting to see how the day would unfold. The park's usual tranquility was disrupted by the crunch of gravel as a luxury electric sedan pulled into the parking lot. Out stepped two uniformed officers, Officer Carter and Officer Miller. Carter, a younger officer with a sharp gaze and a confident stride, adjusted his belt as he surveyed the park. Miller, older and visibly weary, followed at a slower pace, his coffee-stained uniform hinting at years of wear and tear on the job. "Another one," Carter muttered, nodding toward Kim on the bench. "This park's turning into a magnet for squatters." Miller sighed, his expression one of resigned exhaustion. "Maybe she's harmless. Let's just see what's going on before jumping to conclusions." The two approached the bench, their boots crunching on the path. Kim remained still, her gaze fixed on the fountain ahead. Her body language was calm, almost indifferent, but her heart raced. She knew this moment would define the rest of the day's experiment. "Ma'am," Carter began, his tone curt, "you can't sit here all day. This is a public park, not your living room." Kim slowly looked up, her eyes partially obscured by the shadow of her cap. She said nothing, instead reaching into her tote bag. Carter's hand instinctively moved toward the baton at his hip. Miller's voice broke the tension. "Easy," he murmured, his tone carrying a note of caution. Kim pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, unwrapping it with deliberate slowness. She took a bite, chewing quietly as if the officers weren't even there. "Did you hear me?" Carter snapped, stepping closer. "I said you can't sit here all day. You got somewhere to go?" Kim swallowed her bite, her gaze briefly flicking to the younger officer before returning to her sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said calmly. "Just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," Carter shot back, his tone growing harsher. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." Miller sighed again, crossing his arms as he observed the exchange. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice less aggressive than his partner's. Kim hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the sandwich. "Kim," she said finally. "Kim Johnson." Carter smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Kim Johnson, huh? Got an ID on you?" Kim reached into her bag once more, retrieving a well-worn wallet. She handed it to Carter, who flipped it open with practiced precision. The ID inside bore her alias and a nondescript photo, carefully designed to avoid recognition. Carter scrutinized it before handing it back, his suspicion unabated. "What are you doing here, Kim?" he asked. "Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" Kim's expression didn't waver. "I like the fresh air," she replied simply. "Is that a crime?" Miller shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "She's not doing anything illegal," he said quietly. "We can't just kick her out." "Maybe not," Carter muttered, his eyes narrowing. "But we can make it uncomfortable for her." Kim's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her sandwich again, taking another slow, deliberate bite. The tension in the air was palpable, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. A woman walking her dog hesitated, her gaze flicking between the officers and Kim. "She's not hurting anyone," the woman called out hesitantly. "Why are you bothering her?" Carter turned toward her, his face hardening. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. Move along." "It's a public park," the woman shot back. "She has as much right to be here as anyone else." Miller stepped in, raising a placating hand. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Please move along." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her dog's leash. Finally, she shook her head and continued walking, muttering under her breath. Kim watched her go, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. She set her sandwich down, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Am I free to go?" she asked, her tone calm, but with a subtle edge. "You're not under arrest," Miller said, though his partner shot him a warning glance. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit." Kim nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on Carter for a moment longer than necessary. Then she stood, picking up her tote bag and tucking it under her arm. She adjusted her cap, her posture tall and deliberate. "Have a nice day," she said, her voice low but pointed. As she walked away, the tension in the park began to ease, but something lingered in the air, an unspoken challenge, a defiance that hadn't been extinguished. Carter watched her go, his jaw tightening. "There's something off about her," he muttered to Miller. "I don't trust her." "You don't have to trust her," Miller replied wearily. "You just have to leave her alone." Kim's steps were measured as she disappeared down the path, the camera in her bag capturing every moment. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. What do you think about this interaction? Have you ever witnessed something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could inspire change. The deeper unveiling. Kim's heart pounded as she exited the park and turned onto a quieter side street, the noise of Greenwood Park fading behind her. The camera embedded in her tote bag was still live, broadcasting every moment to millions of viewers worldwide. She knew the stakes were higher than ever. Every step she took, every word she spoke was now part of a narrative that demanded attention. But it wasn't fear that drove her forward. It was resolve. This wasn't just a campaign. It was a mission. She ducked into a small cafe, the faint aroma of roasted coffee beans mingling with the hum of quiet conversations. It was a welcome reprieve from the tension that had built during her interaction with the officers. She ordered a coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone. Comments from the live stream poured in faster than she could read. "This is exactly why we need people like Kim." "Unreal. They just assumed the worst." "Keep going, Kim. Don't let them win." Her heart ached as she scrolled. The messages were a mix of outrage, support, and disbelief. But one comment caught her attention. "This is my life every day. Thank you for showing the world." Kim's chest tightened. For so many, this wasn't just an isolated experience. It was a daily reality. And for those who didn't have a voice or a platform, it was often a reality endured in silence. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "The officers haven't left the park. Carter looks furious. Be careful." Kim stared at the message, her mind racing. She could feel the tension lingering in the air, like a storm waiting to break. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the chat feed again as viewers speculated about what might happen next. Back in Greenwood Park, Officer Carter paced near the central fountain, his frustration evident in the sharp movements of his hands. He turned to Miller, who leaned against the cruiser with a tired expression. "There's something about her," Carter muttered. "I don't like it. She was too calm, too confident. It's like she wanted us to notice her." Miller shrugged, sipping from a fresh cup of coffee. "Or maybe she was just eating lunch like she said. Not everything is a conspiracy, Carter." "No," Carter snapped, shaking his head. "You didn't see the way she looked at me. Like she knew something I didn't. Like she was testing me." Miller sighed, setting his coffee on the hood of the car. "Listen, we've done our job. She wasn't breaking the law. Let it go." But Carter couldn't. The interaction gnawed at him, the woman's calm demeanor refusing to leave his mind. He replayed the scene over and over, searching for something, anything, that justified his unease. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it," Carter said, turning to his partner. "She's hiding something." "What, exactly?" Miller asked, his tone sharp. "A sandwich? A fake ID? Come on, Carter. Sometimes people are just people." "No," Carter muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. "There's more to it. I can feel it." Kim stepped out of the cafe, her tote bag slung over her shoulder. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across Liberty Square. She had received another text from her assistant. "They're leaving the park. Looks like they're heading toward the square. Be ready." Kim adjusted her baseball cap, her heart pounding as she prepared for the next phase. She wasn't looking for confrontation, but she knew it might find her anyway. The weight of her mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her own experience. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that so many had suffered under for far too long. As she walked through the square, she spotted a group of volunteers handing out food and blankets to a line of people experiencing homelessness. The scene brought a lump to her throat. She approached one of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Thank you for doing this," Kim said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. The woman smiled back. "We do what we can, but it's never enough." She glanced at Kim's tote bag, the camera hidden inside, unknowingly capturing the exchange. "Are you filming?" Kim hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It's part of a campaign," she explained. "I'm trying to show what really happens out here, how people are treated." The woman's smile faltered, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I've seen it firsthand. People assume the worst. They don't see the humanity in others anymore." Kim reached out, gently squeezing the woman's arm. That's what I'm trying to change. Your work matters, even if it doesn't always feel that way. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Meanwhile, Carter and Miller cruised slowly into Liberty Square, the tension between them palpable. "Why are we even here?" Miller asked, his voice heavy with frustration. "We should be back on patrol, not chasing ghosts." Carter didn't answer. His eyes scanned the square, searching for a familiar figure. When he spotted Kim near the volunteers, his jaw tightened. "There she is," he muttered, pulling the car to a stop. Miller groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Carter, just let it go. She's not doing anything." But Carter was already out of the car, his stride purposeful as he approached Kim. Miller followed reluctantly, his expression one of resigned exhaustion. Kim saw them coming, her heart sinking as she braced herself. She stepped away from the volunteers, her posture calm, but her pulse racing. "Miss Johnson," Carter called, his tone sharp, "we need to have another conversation." Kim raised an eyebrow, her voice steady, as she replied, "Am I under arrest?" "You're not," Miller interjected quickly, casting a wary glance at his partner. "We just have a few more questions." Kim crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "About what? Eating lunch in a park?" Carter stepped closer, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "About why you're here, about who you really are." Kim's lips curved into a faint smile, her calm demeanor only fueling Carter's irritation. "I've already told you who I am. What more do you need?" The interaction drew the attention of passers-by, their curious gazes adding to the tension. A young man with a camera phone began recording, his voice audible as he muttered, "This is unreal. She's literally just standing there." Kim's tote bag continued to stream the encounter live, the comments pouring in faster than ever. Why won't they just leave her alone? This is harassment, plain and simple. "Kim's handling this better than I would." Carter's jaw tightened as he noticed the growing crowd. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You think you're clever, don't you? Walking around like you own the place." "I think it's a public square," Kim replied evenly. "And last I checked, I have the same rights as anyone else." Miller stepped in, his tone pleading. "Carter, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But Carter wasn't listening. His frustration had reached a boiling point, his mind racing with suspicion and doubt. Kim met his gaze, her voice soft but firm. "The only thing I've done wrong is refuse to disappear. And if that bothers you, maybe you should ask yourself why. What would you do in Kim's position? Have you ever experienced a moment where standing your ground felt like the only option? Share your story in the comments below. The power of a name, Kim Kardashian, stood tall, her signature grace cloaked in the simplicity of her oversized hoodie and baseball cap. Despite her unassuming attire, the energy around her had shifted. Liberty Square was no longer just a location, it had become a stage. The crowd around her grew steadily, murmurs rippling as the tension between her and the officers intensified. "Miss Kardashian," Officer Carter said sharply, his voice cutting through the hum of the square. You've got everyone fooled with your act, but not me. You're here for more than fresh air. So, why don't you drop the games and tell us the real reason you're here?" The name lingered in the air, heavy with recognition. The crowd gasped, their whispers escalating as phones were raised to capture the moment. For the first time, it seemed Carter realized who he was talking to. The weight of the realization hit Miller too, his hand nervously twitching toward his belt. Kim lowered her hood, revealing her face fully to the crowd and the officers. Her perfectly sculpted features, instantly recognizable, were now on display. The cameras flashed, but Kim's expression remained calm, unshaken. She met Carter's gaze, her voice steady but laced with quiet authority. "Yes, I'm Kim Kardashian," she said, "and I'm here for the same reason I was in Greenwood Park, to expose the biases and mistreatment so many face every single day." Carter's jaw tightened, his confidence cracking under the weight of her words. Miller stepped back, his unease written all over his face. But Carter wasn't ready to back down. "You think your name changes anything?" he sneered. "You're still disrupting public order, turning this square into a circus." Kim took a step forward, her voice rising just enough to carry over the crowd. "A circus?" she repeated. "This circus is what happens when people refuse to stay silent. If my presence here is disruptive, maybe it's because you're not used to being held accountable." The crowd erupted in applause, their support drowning out Carter's next words. For a moment, he stood frozen, his authority slipping away with each passing second. Miller placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something too low for the crowd to hear. But it was clear. This was a battle Carter was losing. Kim turned to face the crowd fully now, her voice strong and unwavering. "I came here today to shine a light on what so many people face when they're judged not for who they are, but for who others assume them to be. I've seen it time and time again. People ignored, dismissed, and mistreated simply because they don't fit a certain image." Her words struck a chord, the silence of the crowd broken only by the occasional click of a camera. She glanced back at the officers, her gaze softening slightly as she continued. "I'm not here to vilify anyone," she said, "but I am here to ask questions. Why was I, sitting on a bench eating lunch, treated like a threat? Why was your first instinct suspicion, not compassion?" Carter looked away, his face flushed with embarrassment. Miller, on the other hand, seemed to absorb her words, his posture shifting as though a weight had been lifted. The tension in Liberty Square shifted as the narrative began to change. Reporters arrived, microphones thrust toward the scene as they tried to capture every word. One journalist stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Ms. Kardashian, are you saying this was a planned event?" Kim nodded, her honesty disarming. "Yes, it was. I wanted to experience for myself what so many others go through daily. But what I didn't plan was the hostility. That was real, and unfortunately, it's all too common." The journalist pressed further. "What do you hope to achieve with this?" Kim's response was immediate, her tone filled with conviction. "Change, awareness, accountability. This isn't just about me or this moment. It's about every person who's been dismissed, mistreated, or ignored. If my platform can amplify their voices, then that's exactly what I'll do." As the crowd cheered, Carter's frustration reached a boiling point. He stepped forward, his voice raised. "Enough of this. You're using your fame to create a spectacle, to make us look like the bad guys." Kim turned back to him, her expression calm but firm. "No, Officer Carter, you're making yourself look that way. My fame doesn't dictate your actions. You do." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, Carter had no response. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their support for Kim palpable. Miller stepped between them, his voice low but firm. "Carter, let's go. We've done enough damage here." But Carter shook his head, his pride refusing to let him back down. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice trembling with frustration. Kim's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're right," she said. "It's not over, but the rest of the story isn't up to you. It's up to all of us." The officers finally retreated, their departure met with applause from the crowd. Kim turned to face the cameras once more, her voice strong and clear. "This isn't about one officer or one encounter," she said. "It's about a system that allows bias to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. We have to do better, and we will." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "Your voice has power," she added. "Never doubt it, and never let anyone tell you otherwise." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electrifying the square. Kim stepped back, letting the moment belong to them. This wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's. What would you do if faced with the same challenges? Have you ever felt judged or dismissed for how you looked or where you were? Share your story in the comments below. Together, we can keep this conversation going and push for real change. A ripple becomes a wave. Kim Kardashian stood at the center of Liberty Square, her face illuminated by the late afternoon sun. The crowd surrounding her had grown, their voices blending into a hum of support and curiosity. Despite the applause and cheers, Kim's focus was unwavering. This wasn't about her fame or the attention. It was about the message she had come to deliver. As the officers disappeared into the distance, a young girl stepped forward, clutching a folded piece of paper in her small hands. She couldn't have been older than 12, her oversized hoodie hanging loosely on her tiny frame. Kim noticed her immediately, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "What's your name?" Kim asked gently, her voice warm and inviting. "Maria," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the paper. I just wanted to say thank you." Kim smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. Your voice matters just as much as mine. What's on the paper?" Maria unfolded the note, her hands trembling. "It's a letter about my mom. She was arrested last year, but she didn't do anything wrong. They just didn't believe her." Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she spoke. "She told me to never stop believing in justice, but it's hard." Kim's heart broke at the sight of the young girl's pain. She reached out, taking the letter gently from Maria's hands. Your mom sounds like an amazing person, Kim said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. And you're so brave for sharing this. I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure stories like hers aren't ignored. The crowd, now completely silent, watched as Kim stood, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She turned back to the cameras, her voice carrying the weight of Maria's story. "This is why we're here," Kim said, her voice steady but passionate. "This letter, this little girl, this is what's at stake. It's not about making a scene or calling people out. It's about demanding a world where children like Maria don't have to grow up questioning justice, where their families aren't torn apart by assumptions and bias." The crowd erupted into cheers, many wiping away tears. Maria stepped back into the arms of an older woman, likely her grandmother, who whispered something comforting in her ear. Kim watched them for a moment, her resolve hardening. Meanwhile, inside a nearby police precinct, Officer Carter paced furiously. His pride was wounded, and the weight of the public humiliation gnawed at him. Officer Miller sat silently at a desk, watching Carter's movements with a mix of concern and resignation. "You saw how she twisted it," Carter spat, his voice sharp. "She turned the whole thing into a spectacle. It wasn't about justice, it was about her." Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Or maybe it was about something bigger than us," he said quietly. "Maybe she's right. Maybe we are a part of the problem." Carter froze, glaring at his partner. "You're taking her side?" "I'm not taking anyone's side," Miller replied calmly. "I'm saying we need to look at ourselves. You saw the crowd, Carter. People are tired of being treated like they don't matter. Maybe it's time we start listening." Carter slammed his fist on the desk, his frustration boiling over. "Listening won't change anything. She's just using her fame to make us look bad." Miller sighed, standing slowly. "You can believe that if it helps you sleep at night. But deep down, I think you know she's on to something." Back in Liberty Square, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to hope. Volunteers approached Kim, thanking her for bringing attention to the struggles they saw every day. A man in his 40s, his clothes worn but his eyes bright with determination, stepped forward. "Ms. Kardashian," he began, his voice shaky but firm. "I've been living on the streets for 3 years. People walk past me like I'm invisible, like I don't exist. But today I feel seen. Thank you for that." Kim placed a hand on his arm, her expression soft. "You deserve to be seen. Every person here does. And I won't stop until the world starts paying attention." The man nodded, tears streaming down his face. "You've already done more than most ever would." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the square, Kim stepped onto a makeshift platform, addressing the crowd one final time. "This isn't the end," she began, her voice ringing out clearly. "This is just the beginning. Today, we've shown that when we stand together, we can create change. But it doesn't stop here. We have to keep fighting, keep speaking up, and keep demanding better for Maria, for her mom, for the man who just spoke, and for every single person who has ever felt invisible." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the square. Kim's heart swelled with emotion as she looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with hope and determination. As the cameras continued to roll, Kim stepped down from the platform, her assistant rushing to her side. "The footage is already trending," the assistant said breathlessly. "It's everywhere." Kim nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Good. Let's make sure it stays that way." The night fell, but the momentum didn't fade. Across social media, the live stream continued to spark conversations, with hashtags like Number Justice for All and Number Voices heard trending worldwide. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people shared their stories inspired by Kim's actions. Back at her hotel, Kim sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The letter Maria had given her rested on the desk, a stark reminder of why she had started this campaign in the first place. Her phone buzzed with messages of support, but one caught her attention. "Thank you for giving us hope. You're changing lives." Kim smiled faintly, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time in a while, she felt like they were heading in the right direction. What about you? Have you ever felt invisible or dismissed? Share your story in the comments below. Together, we can continue to push for change. The ripple effect. The city buzzed with the aftermath of Kim Kardashian's bold stand in Liberty Square. Across social media, the footage of her encounter with Officer Carter had become a lightning rod for debate. Television anchors analyzed her words, influencers reposted her message, and millions of people worldwide felt the ripple of her actions. But for Kim, this wasn't a time to celebrate. It was a time to act. Sitting at the sleek wooden desk in her hotel room, Kim carefully reread Maria's letter. Every word seemed heavier the second time. "My mom always told me to believe in justice, but it's hard." The words echoed in her mind, and for a moment she felt the same helplessness Maria must have felt. But Kim wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Her phone buzzed. It was her assistant. "Kim, you won't believe this," the voice on the other end said, almost breathless. "3 major news outlets want to do a feature on today's events. And there's more. Families are coming forward, sharing their stories. You've started something massive." Kim closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. She felt the weight of those stories, the responsibility to keep the momentum alive. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about them. Let's organize something bigger." By the next morning, a plan was in motion. Kim's team set up a live town hall in a community center on the edge of Liberty Square. The room was modest, folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a simple stage at the front, but the atmosphere was electric. The live stream was already active, and hundreds of people packed into the room while thousands more tuned in online. Kim stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to her collar. Her nerves buzzed, but her determination was stronger. She wasn't just speaking for herself today. She was speaking for Maria, for her mother, for every person who had been silenced. As she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. Kim held up her hand, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady, despite the overwhelming energy in the room. Thank you for being here, for showing up, not just for me, but for each other. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Maria and her grandmother sitting in the front row. Maria gave her a small, shy wave, and Kim's smile grew warmer. Yesterday, we saw the power of standing up, of refusing to be invisible. But today, we're here to listen, because change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we come together. The first speaker was a woman named Carla, her hands trembling as she held the microphone. Her voice cracked as she recounted her story of losing her job after speaking out against mistreatment. "I was told to stay quiet," Carla said, her eyes brimming with tears. "But staying quiet didn't save me. It just made it easier for them to dismiss me." The room erupted into applause, people shouting words of encouragement. Kim leaned forward, nodding. "Thank you for sharing that, Carla. Your courage reminds us why we're here." One by one, others came forward. A man who had been wrongfully arrested shared his harrowing experience of spending weeks in jail for a crime he didn't commit. A young mother spoke about being evicted because her landlord didn't want to rent to a single parent. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, painting a vivid picture of a system that had failed too many for too long. As the stories continued, Kim's resolve hardened. She took notes, jotting down ideas, contacts, and names. She wasn't just listening, she was building a plan. Outside the community center, a very different scene was unfolding. Officer Carter sat in his squad car parked across the street. His face was a mask of frustration and humiliation. He had been called into his captain's office earlier that morning, reprimanded for his behavior in Liberty Square. "You've put the department in the spotlight," Captain Davis had said, her tone sharp, "and not in a good way." Now, Carter watched the line of people waiting to get into the town hall, their faces alight with hope and determination. He clenched the steering wheel, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to march inside, to defend himself, to shout that he wasn't the villain they were making him out to be. But another part, the part he tried to ignore, felt the sting of guilt. Was Miller right? Had he let his biases dictate his actions? The passenger door opened, and Miller slid into the seat, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing one to Carter. Carter took it without a word, his gaze still fixed on the crowd. "What are they even hoping to accomplish in there?" he muttered. "Maybe something good," Miller replied, his tone neutral. "Maybe it's not about tearing us down, Carter. Maybe it's about asking us to do better." Carter didn't respond, but his grip on the coffee cup tightened. Back inside, Kim wrapped up the town hall with a promise. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "Today, we've shared stories. Tomorrow, we'll take action. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this." The room erupted into applause as Kim stepped down from the stage, her heart pounding. Maria ran up to her, wrapping her small arms around Kim's waist. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening." Kim knelt down, looking Maria in the eyes. "Thank you for sharing," she replied. "You're braver than most adults I know." As Maria returned to her grandmother's side, Kim's assistant approached, phone in hand. "The live stream hit 5 million viewers," she said, "and the hashtag #sign voices heard is trending worldwide." Kim smiled, but it was a smile tinged with determination. "Good," she said, "because we're just getting started." That evening, as Kim sat in her hotel room, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text read, "Ms. Kardashian, this is Captain Laura Davis. I'd like to meet with you to discuss next steps. I think we can find common ground." Kim stared at the message, her mind racing. This could be the breakthrough she'd been hoping for, or another obstacle. Either way, she knew one thing. She wasn't going to back down. What about you? Have you ever been part of something bigger than yourself? Share your story in the comments below, because every voice matters, and yours could inspire the next wave of change. Bridging divides. The next morning, sunlight spilled into Kim Kardashian's hotel room as she sat at the desk, staring at her phone. The message from Captain Laura Davis was still open, its simple words carrying the weight of an opportunity and a challenge. "I'd like to meet with you to discuss next steps. I think we can find common ground." Kim tapped her fingers on the desk, weighing her options. Agreeing to meet could open the door to real change, or it could be a trap, a move to quiet the momentum she had worked so hard to build. But one thing was clear. Doing nothing wasn't an option. Her assistant walked in, holding a cup of coffee. "The captain called again," she said. "She's waiting for your response." Kim nodded, her resolve hardening. "Tell her I'll meet her, but it's going to be on my terms." Hours later, Kim arrived at a neutral location, a small, unassuming conference room at a community center on the outskirts of Liberty Square. The media was kept at bay, but a few trusted members of her team discreetly filmed the encounter for accountability. Captain Davis was already there, sitting at the head of the table. Her crisp uniform and sharp eyes exuded authority, but there was a flicker of unease in her expression. "Ms. Kardashian," Davis said, standing as Kim entered the room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Kim shook her hand, her grip firm. "I'm here because I want solutions, Captain, not just apologies." Davis nodded, gesturing for Kim to sit. "That's why I reached out. I've been watching what's unfolded over the last few days, and I think there's an opportunity here for all of us." Kim's eyebrows lifted slightly, her skepticism evident. "An opportunity for what? Damage control? Because that's not why I'm here." Davis leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "I won't pretend we don't have problems. What happened in the park with my officers was unacceptable. And while I can't undo what's already happened, I want to work with you to address the root causes." Kim studied her for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. "Words are easy, Captain, but actions are what matter. So, what do you have in mind?" Davis took a deep breath. "We've been discussing implementing new training programs, ones that focus on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. But training isn't enough. We need accountability. I want to work with you to create a citizen oversight committee, A group of civilians who can review cases like this and ensure transparency. The room fell silent. Kim leaned back in her chair, processing the proposal. It was more than she had expected, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down. "That sounds promising," Kim said carefully. "But how do I know this isn't just a PR move? Something to quiet the outrage until the headlines fade?" Davis's expression softened. "Because I'm tired too, Ms. Kardashian. I've been in this job long enough to see how broken the system is. I've lost officers to burnout, to bad decisions, to a culture that doesn't support doing the right thing. I want change as much as you do." Kim leaned forward, her voice firm. "If we do this, it has to be real. No half measures. No committees that are just for show. Real power, real transparency." Davis nodded. "Agreed." The conversation stretched into hours as they ironed out the details. By the end of the meeting, they had the framework of a plan. The Oversight Committee would include representatives from marginalized communities, activists, and legal experts. Officers like Carter would face real consequences for misconduct, and training programs would be mandatory, not optional. As Kim left the conference room, her phone buzzed with a flood of messages. The news of her meeting with Davis had leaked, and social media was ablaze with speculation. Kim Kardashian is actually working with the police. This better not be a sellout move. If anyone can hold them accountable, it's Kim. Kim sighed, handing her phone to her assistant. "The real work starts now," she said quietly. Later that evening, Kim returned to Liberty Square, where the energy had shifted. What was once a scene of tension and confrontation now felt like a place of hope and possibility. Volunteers handed out flyers about the new oversight initiative, while others gathered in small groups to discuss their own experiences with injustice. Maria and her grandmother approached Kim, their faces lit with cautious optimism. "Is it true?" Maria asked, her eyes wide. "You're working with the police?" Kim knelt down, looking Maria in the eye. "Yes," she said, "because real change doesn't happen by staying on opposite sides. It happens when we come together, even when it's hard." Maria nodded slowly, her trust in Kim unwavering. "I think my mom would be proud of you." Kim swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I hope so, Maria, and I hope she knows how proud she should be of you." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Carter sat alone in the locker room, his head in his hands. The reprimands, the public humiliation, and the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. For the first time, he questioned everything he thought he knew about his role, about power, about respect. Miller entered the room, his footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. "You okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. Carter looked up, his eyes red. "Do you think she's right? About us? About me?" Miller hesitated before answering. "I think we all have blind spots, Carter, and maybe it's time we start seeing them." Carter nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to be this person anymore." "Then don't," Miller said simply. "It's never too late to change." That night, Kim sat by her hotel window, staring out at the city lights. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. The ripple she had started was growing into a wave, and she was determined to ride it as far as it would go. Her phone buzzed with a new notification. Voices heard reaches 10 million posts worldwide. Kim smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of Maria's letter, which still sat on her desk. The work was far from over, but for now she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Change is coming, she whispered to herself, and this is just the beginning. Have you ever found yourself at the crossroads of action and inaction? What did you choose, and how did it shape your life? Share your story in the comments below, because your voice has power too. Turning the tide. It had been a week since Kim Kardashian's meeting with Captain Laura Davis, but the effects of their conversation were already rippling across the city. News outlets buzzed with updates about the Oversight Committee, and social media was ablaze with discussions about justice, accountability, and change. Yet, for Kim, the work had only just begun. The first meeting of the Oversight Committee was scheduled for that afternoon, and Kim's nerves were palpable as she arrived at the city's civic center. The building was modest, its walls lined with faded photos of past mayors and city officials, but today it carried the weight of something historic. Inside, a group of people gathered around a long table. Among them were activists, legal experts, community leaders, and even a few police officers, including Captain Davis. Kim scanned the faces, noting the tension in the room. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a collision of perspectives that rarely shared the same space. "Good afternoon," Davis began, her voice firm but welcoming. "Today, we're here to begin a new chapter for our city. This committee represents something we've never attempted before, a true partnership between the community and law enforcement." Kim nodded, taking her seat. "This can't just be about dialogue," she said. "It has to lead to real change, policies, practices, and accountability." An activist named Jamal, a tall man with a commanding presence, leaned forward. "We've heard promises like this before," he said, his tone skeptical. "What makes this different?" Kim met his gaze directly. "Because this time, we're not waiting for permission to make change. We're demanding it, and we're holding each other accountable, starting now." As the meeting unfolded, the tension in the room began to ease. Jamal shared stories of young men in his neighborhood who had been unfairly profiled. A legal expert detailed the steps needed to ensure transparency in investigations. Captain Davis listened intently, taking notes and offering input where she could. Kim felt a flicker of hope as the group began to find common ground, but it was clear that the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Outside the Civic Center, a very different scene was unfolding. Officer Carter stood on the sidewalk, watching people come and go. His reprimand had kept him off active duty, and he now found himself on the sidelines of the very system he once took pride in. He spotted Kim leaving the building, flanked by her assistant and a few other committee members. For a moment, he considered walking away, but something kept him rooted in place. "Ms. Kardashian," he called out, his voice hesitant. Kim stopped, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. "Officer Carter," she replied, her tone cautious. "What can I do for you?" Carter hesitated, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I wanted to apologize for how I acted. In the park and afterward, I was wrong." Kim's expression softened, though her guard remained up. "I appreciate that," she said, "but an apology isn't enough. What are you going to do about it?" Carter swallowed hard, her words cutting through him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent my whole career thinking I was doing the right thing. Now, I'm not so sure." Kim stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Then start by listening. Come to the next committee meeting. Hear what people have to say. Maybe it'll help you figure out what the right thing really looks like." Carter nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." "Don't just think," Kim said, turning to leave. "Do." That evening, Kim returned to her hotel room, exhausted but energized. The day had been a whirlwind of meetings and media inquiries, but she couldn't stop thinking about Carter. His apology, while unexpected, felt incomplete. Still, it was a start. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. "We made progress today, but there's so much more to do. Thanks for sticking with this." Kim smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "This is just the beginning. We're in this together." In the days that followed, the Oversight Committee gained traction. Community forums were held across the city, allowing residents to share their stories and voice their concerns. The media began to shift its narrative, focusing less on the spectacle of Kim's initial encounter in the park and more on the systemic issues she was fighting to address. At one such forum, Maria and her grandmother shared their story. The room fell silent as Maria's grandmother recounted the night her daughter was arrested, her voice trembling with emotion. "They didn't see her for who she was," the grandmother said. "They just saw what they wanted to see. And now my granddaughter is growing up without her mother." Maria clutched her grandmother's hand, tears streaming down her face. Kim sat in the audience, her own eyes welling with emotion. She knew that stories like this were why she couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Meanwhile, Carter's internal struggle continued. He attended one of the committee meetings, sitting quietly in the back as residents shared their frustrations with law enforcement. Each story chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, forcing him to confront the reality he had long ignored. After the meeting, he approached Jamal, his expression conflicted. "I want to help," he said simply. "I don't know how, but I want to do better." Jamal studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then start by showing up, not just here, but out there. Talk to people, listen to them, be part of the solution." By the end of the month, the Oversight Committee had finalized its first set of recommendations. The proposals included mandatory bias training, the creation of an independent review board for misconduct cases, and a pilot program pairing officers with community mentors. Kim stood at the press conference announcing the changes, her heart pounding as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't the end of our work," she said, her voice steady. "It's the foundation for something bigger." Change doesn't happen overnight, but with persistence and unity, it does happen. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Kim stepped back, letting the moment belong to the people she had fought so hard to represent. That night, as Kim sat by her hotel window, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The city lights glittered below, a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Voices heard hits 15 million posts. Kim smiled, a sense of quiet pride washing over her. But even as she celebrated the progress, she knew there was still so much work to do. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself, her resolve as strong as ever. What about you? Have you ever had to confront your own biases or challenge someone else's? Share your story in the comments below, because together we can keep pushing for change. A new dawn, the sun rose over the city, casting a warm golden glow on Liberty Square. It had been a month since the Oversight Committee was officially established, and while there was still much to be done, the first signs of change were beginning to show. The square, once filled with tension and confrontation, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one of hope and renewal. Kim Kardashian stood near the central fountain, the place where it had all begun. Dressed simply in jeans and a blazer, she blended in with the crowd that had gathered for the morning's event. Volunteers handed out flyers about the new oversight programs, while community leaders spoke to small groups about ongoing initiatives. Kim glanced down at her phone, her live stream already active. Comments flooded in from viewers around the world. "This is what real change looks like." "Thank you, Kim, for using your platform for something meaningful." "This gives me hope for my city." Her assistant approached, holding a clipboard. "They're ready for you," she said with a smile. Kim nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping up onto a small stage. The crowd quieted, their attention fully on her as she adjusted the microphone. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Standing here today, I can't help but think about how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. What started as a simple moment in this square has grown into something bigger than any of us could have imagined." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But this isn't about me. It's about every person who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or unvalued. It's about Maria and her family. It's about the man I met in Liberty Square who told me he finally felt visible. It's about all of you." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Kim smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. "This isn't the end of our fight," she continued. "It's just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it happens when people come together, when we refuse to accept things as they are and demand something better." She gestured to the group of volunteers behind her. "This team, this community, has shown me what's possible when we work together. The Oversight Committee, the new programs, the conversations we've started, none of it would have been possible without all of you." Kim's voice softened as she looked out at the crowd. "And to those of you watching from home, I want you to know that your voice matters. Your story matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. As the event continued, Kim stepped off the stage and made her way through the crowd, stopping to talk to attendees and listen to their stories. She spotted Maria and her grandmother near one of the volunteer tables, their faces lit with excitement. Maria ran up to Kim, clutching a small notebook. "I've been writing stories," she said proudly, "about my mom, about everything you've done." Kim knelt down, her eyes brimming with emotion. "That's amazing, Maria. Keep writing. Your voice is so important." Maria smiled shyly, her eyes shining with hope. "Do you think she'll see them?" "My mom?" Kim placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "I know she will, and she'll be so proud of you." Meanwhile, across the city, Officer Carter sat in the back of a community meeting, listening intently as residents shared their concerns. It had been weeks since his apology to Kim, and while he still had a long way to go, he was beginning to see the world through a different lens. At one point, a young man stood up, his voice shaking as he recounted a time he had been unfairly profiled by police. Carter felt a pang of guilt, recognizing the same biases he had once carried. When the man finished speaking, Carter raised his hand. "I'm Officer Carter," he said, standing slowly, "and I just want to say I'm sorry. I don't know your story, but I know I've been part of the problem, and I want to be part of the solution." The room fell silent for a moment before the young man nodded. "Then show us," he said simply. "Don't just say it, prove it." Carter nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will." As the sun began to set over Liberty Square, Kim sat on the same old oak bench where her journey had started. The square was quieter now, the crowd thinning as the event wound down. She stared at the fountain, lost in thought, when Captain Davis approached. "Quite a day," Davis said, sitting beside her. Kim nodded. "It's a start." Davis leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, when this all began, I wasn't sure we'd get here. But seeing what's happening now, it gives me hope." Kim smiled faintly. "Hope's a powerful thing, but it's only as strong as the actions we take." Davis nodded, her expression serious. "Then let's make sure the actions match the hope." As the last rays of sunlight bathed the square in a golden glow, Kim took out a small notebook and began to write. She wrote about Maria, about Carter, about every person who had shared their story. She wrote about the spark that had started in Liberty Square and how it had grown into a movement. When she finished, she tucked the notebook into her bag and stood, her gaze lingering on the fountain one last time. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like they were truly moving in the right direction. Kim turned and walked away, her steps purposeful, her heart full. And as she disappeared into the city, her voice echoed in the minds of those she had inspired. Your voice has power. Never doubt it. What about you? Has this story inspired you to take action in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because together we can create the change we wish to see in the world.